here. Hello. My name is Joe Madden. I'm a principal analyst at Mobile Experts in California. And we focus on market analysis for the mobile communications market. And really, we focus exclusively on the RF side of things. So we look at the link from the handset through the base station back again. And what I wanted to talk about today is deployment of cellular infrastructure and how that's changing in the next few years from macro systems to small cells and other things. Okay. Just to quickly introduce my company, we're a small outfit. We're not a big research firm. We're just a few RF guys. And we were founded about 10 years ago. We have 3 analysts and a couple of people on the office staff. Based in Silicon Valley, and again, we focus exclusively on the radio chain. What we do is we present market studies. We essentially put together a 5-year forecast for the RF semiconductors in the handset, in the transceivers at the base station, and we look at small cells and carrier Wi-Fi as well. Just an example of some reports we published, you can find these on our website. Okay, and so what I wanted to talk about today is really the evolution of the mobile network. I think a lot of you remember the days when they were putting up towers, and the idea was to get a lot of power up there so that you could cover a broad area, and everyone talked about coverage all the time. The metrics that you used were, at a mobile operator level, they would talk about how much it costs them to cover a square kilometer. And it's obviously a big tower, and a lot of power is the way to do that. But over the last year or so, that's changing. And now when I talk with people on my mobile operator advisory panel, I have 32 different operators that sort of advise me, and I share my forecast with them. They're talking about a different metric. It has to do with how much it costs me for a megabits per second of capacity, or how much it costs for a gigabit of information to go through the network. And so, this shift is happening at different times in different places. We've already made the shift here in the U.S., in places like Japan and Korea. There are other countries in Africa, for example, we're still talking about coverage for voice communications. So this is not a perfect fine line around the world. It's happening at different times. But when we look at what's going on with some of the more advanced systems, the future is really this heterogeneous network that has a lot of different elements to it. And the macro systems will be changing. I've listed a few of the options here, with these big blue circles, where you cover a large area. There's integration between the antenna and the radio. So those are called IARs, or integrated antenna radios. We have active antenna systems with beam steering arrays that go into the macro base station. And then we're going to fill in a lot of the holes and capacity zones with femto type of technology. Now, I'm not a big fan of femto cells per se in the residential application, but there will be some few million of those per year. And I think the most interesting part of the market has to do with carrier deployed femto cells. And those will go in really high density deployment zones. So what I'm going to do is walk you through some of the high-level charts in my forecast, and anybody that wants to get in touch with me offline, I can talk you through some of these charts later if you'd like as well. But I'm going to talk about macros and small cells and a few other things to give you a feeling how the spending of the mobile operators is shifting. So first of all, on the Macrocell side, one of the things we do is we look at the number of base stations deployed. Now, a base station used to mean that you were putting up a new tower and you put in a 2G cabinet at the base of the tower, or even in a shelter at the base of the tower. And nowadays that's changing. We're not often putting up new towers anymore. When we talk about a new base station delivery, it has to do with taking an existing tower that already has 2G and 3G, and in fact, many times has 3 different operators on the same tower. And we're adding a new frequency band. So we might add in that WCS band for AT&T, or band 4 LTE performance on top of the 2G and 3G systems that are there. When I show this chart, a lot of people say, well, that's not happening. In fact, it is happening because we have a lot of new spectrum being deployed around the world, and we have a lot of these new base stations going into the field. So for the next 5 years, I see expansion in the number of base stations deployed. Now, one of the things I do, because base stations are really hard to track. If you talk to someone like Nokia, Siemens, or Ericsson about how many base stations they deliver, you can get really confusing answers because a lot of times they'll talk about new base station software and installing a software upgrade, and they'll count that as another base station. Or they'll count in terms of revenue, where there's a lot of service revenue built into that. So the way that I take care of that is I actually track the transceiver shipments by frequency band. And I have a lot of relationships with different suppliers, including people that supply power devices, filters, and isolators, something where you have a very specific number of these devices for each transmitter path. And by doing that and tracking by frequency band, I can keep a very accurate count of just how many transceivers were shipped last year. The interesting thing about this is the number of transceivers is actually increasing over the next 4 or 5 years faster than the number of base stations. And what that means is we have more MIMO, right? We have active antenna systems with multiple transceivers per data stream. And I count those separately because I'm counting, I'm trying to make this useful for people that are in the component business that sell something like a filter or an LD-MOS device. So I keep track of it that way. And so we have an increase in the base station market despite all the stuff you're hearing about small cells. Now the hard part about that is that the power level for each of these transceivers is dropping pretty fast. So the days of 200 watts per sector, they're gone. I actually break this up into 3 categories. There's systems that are above 20 watts for a sector. That's dropping dramatically over the next 5 years. There's a lot of transceivers that are designed to operate at a rated power of 20 watts, average power, and that's increasing. But the part that's increasing even more is the number of transceivers below 20 watts, and this has to do with the active antenna systems and other things. The net effect of that is that the RF semiconductor market for the macro base stations is pretty flat. We're gonna see something around a $2 billion market when you include the FPGAs and the transceivers and IQ modulators and things like that, as well as the RF power devices. So that's sort of my view on the macro market. It's still there. It's still going to be a healthy market for some time. It's changing in nature, but it's flat for the semiconductor providers. Okay, so then we start to look at the small cells, and I mentioned earlier there's a lot of different kinds of these things. And I like to talk about small cells on a spectrum of possibilities. We sort of started off with consumer femtocells there on the left. The idea there being you have a unit that's a little bit like a Wi-Fi router. You put it in your house. The end user will own this thing, put it anywhere he wants, and put it on his local broadband for backhaul. That has been done. There's about 2 million of those shipped each year for the last 2-3 years, and it's not growing very fast. What we've found is that the operators really don't like the idea of end users putting these transmitters anywhere they want. It does cause problems for your neighbors. It might improve coverage in your house, but the guy next door might not like it so much. So the operators are learning how to use those in a more targeted way, and it's limiting the market for these consumer femtos. The nice thing about the femto is it's created a sort of a gateway architecture which allows the operators to scale up their networks a lot more rapidly, and to make it a lot easier to auto-configure a new base station and sort of thing. So taking that architecture and starting to do more coordination with the macro system, doing things like hand in and hand out, or even soft handovers with a small cell, that's now becoming possible. And so I think what we're going to see is a whole range of things from what they call Macrocells or LTE picocells that look like, almost look like a macro base station in a smaller box, all the way down to these totally autonomous femtocells. And another way to look at that, going back to my original point about coverage and capacity, is that consumer femtocell unit is intended for a coverage patch. If you have a hole where you live, you can get coverage in your house with a femtocell. But as operators move towards really trying to build up the capacity of their network, they're going to be focused more on the right-hand side of this chart, where they have high-capacity small cells that really reuse the spectrum in a smart way. Okay, and so here's my top-level view of the small cell shipments. I actually have 10 different kinds of small cells that I track in a massive model. But if I summarize those into three categories, we have those consumer units, which sort of started the market off. And again, there's a couple of million a year of those. There's an enterprise version of that, which again is pretty autonomous and would go into a small business or something like that. And those will grow to maybe a million a year. Again, that's more coverage oriented. And the capacity oriented small cells, carrier grade small cells, those are the ones that I believe are going to take off in a more geometric term. I think probably everybody here has seen the Cisco curve, right? It goes doubling every year on the data capacity need. I believe that the small cell curve is going to follow that same pattern, where we're going to see for at least 3 or 4 years doubling of the number of small cells each year to address that capacity need. One of the things I do is, this is just an example of one of the charts I do of the different frequency bands for these small cells. And what I wanted to point out is that for LTE, they're going to be all over the map. We're going to have small cells for rural applications at 450, and we'll have some small cells for high capacity density at 260 or so. And it's going to get more complex than this with carrier aggregation, because I think as we put carrier aggregation into all the handsets, it's unlikely we're going to go out and retrofit all those towers with new filters and more amplifiers and things like that to do multiple bands. More likely we'll have the carrier aggregation built into small cells. So you'll be taking multiple different combinations of 2 of these bands at a time, or maybe someday 3 of these bands at a time to aggregate a fatter tire. You can do that in low power a lot cheaper than you can at retrofitting a tower. Okay, and the third area that I want to talk about is carrier Wi-Fi. One of the things we do is we look at cost models between macro, small cells, Wi-Fi, and this is by far the cheapest way to get a megabit of data into your phone. When we look at the cost for capacity, the LTE systems are something like a factor of 5 cheaper than the original UMTS systems. Going to an LTE small cell, we might get another factor of 3 or 4 out of that. But if you step to carrier Wi-Fi and give up some of those mobility aspects and a lot of the complex software, proprietary things that go with the big OEMs, and you can drop it today a factor of about 10 from the LTE cost. So that's why a lot of operators are already spending a lot of their CAPEX on carrier Wi-Fi. China Mobile has 3 million access points in China now, and so it's already a pretty big market. What's going to change about this is that it's going to grow quite a bit starting this year based on Hotspot 2.0 coming into the market and allowing people to use their SIM card on their phone to authenticate Wi-Fi. That's going to make it a lot easier for the user and a lot more attractive for the operator because they can keep control of that user. Okay, so to wrap it up, the overall trends in the mobile market are, we have the macro base station market changing to lower power levels, but there's still going to be a lot of base stations shipped. Total growth rate in the 15 to 20% range, with the semiconductors being relatively flat based on the price erosion. Carrier Wi-Fi is the thing that's happening in a big way right now, and it's going to ramp from about 500,000 APs per year to 5 million APs by 2018. Small cells are coming in, changing from the coverage mode to the capacity application, and that's going to represent a new market of millions of units. And in this case, instead of $100 Wi-Fi access point, we're talking about a $5,000 small cell. So I think there's going to be, in terms of the dollar value of these various pieces, the small cell market is going to be a pretty significant piece. And the final outcome is that the CAPEX spending will be shifting over the next 5 years. We're going to see an overall reduction in CAPEX for macro base stations, and then some of that money shifting into the Wi-Fi and the small cell area. Okay, so that's the quick speech for today. I just wanted to kind of give a broad overview of what's happening in the mobile market. All right, thanks everyone.